Okay, so now the Buddha has set up this contrast between the two kinds of quests, the ignoble quest and the noble quest. And now the Buddha is going to relate this to his own life story, which is interesting here because you see the Buddha is setting up first the contrast between these two types of, these two types of orientation in life. And then the Buddha is going to show that he understands this from his own experience, that it's not something like he is a pious preacher sitting up on the platform giving a lecture on something he hasn't experienced himself, but he's going to show how he has learned this through his own hard life experience. Okay, so the Buddha says, before my enlightenment, while I was still only a bodhisattva, not yet enlightened, I too, being myself subject to birth, sought what is also subject to birth. And so is what is subject to aging, sickness, death, sorrow, defilement, and so on. So the Buddha, maybe the story about him being an actual prince, it's legendary because the Sakyan state was not a kingdom, but it was a republic. But the Buddha was from one of the aristocratic clans. He would have had all of the privileges of the aristocracy. According to other suttas, his father had built for him 3 palaces, one for each season of the Indian year. He would live in the palace surrounded by dancing girls, musicians. He would have lotus gardens. Certainly he would be eating every day the most delicious food. No worries, no cares, no troubles. Then when he was 16 years old, he was married. And probably as a young man, he was still not satisfied with all of this, but he would always have been seeking more because that was the temperament of the Kshatriyas, the warrior class in India. But at some point, the Buddha then, the Bodhisattva, began to question himself and to ask, why, being myself subject to birth, do I also seek what is subject to birth, and so on. Then he says, suppose that I go out, now that I've seen the danger in what is subject to birth, let me go out to seek the unborn supreme security from bondage, Nibbana. Okay, so this is the way the Buddha is reflecting. You know, in the legendary life of the Buddha, we have this told in the form of a legend that the Bodhisattva didn't even know that there was such a thing as old age, sickness, and death. But one day, out of curiosity, he wanted to see what life was like outside the palace. And so he asked his father, please let me travel outside the palace. His father cleared up the whole city, gave orders, get rid of all of the old people, no sick people, no funerals this day. And so when the Bodhisattva went out, there were all young, beautiful, happy people applauding him and cheering him. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, there appeared an old man walking on a stick, then a sick man lying on the side of the road, trembling and weeping, and then a funeral took place with a corpse being carried to the cremation ground. So that is, we call this the legend. It's a kind of external representation of what is really going on in the Bodhisattva's mind, which is reflecting deeply on the real facts of life. Reflecting on birth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement. Okay, so then he says, a little sometime later, while still a young man in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, put on the kshaya, it's not really yellow, it's a kind of brownish-orange robe, and I went forth from the home life into homelessness. Okay, during the Buddha's time, and probably going back even several hundred years earlier, it was the custom for those who wanted to realize truth, to achieve liberation from the cycle of birth and death, to leave the household life and take on the lifestyle of what is called a samana. The samana is an ascetic, a monastic person, a renunciant. And so when the Bodhisattva was a prince thinking about leaving the household life, or thinking about the problems of birth, old age, sickness and death, he had a certain precedent or a model to follow, and that is to adopt the lifestyle of an ascetic. And so in the Buddha's time there were ascetics who were living in the forest, sometimes alone, sometimes in communities. Some of them would just wear a loincloth, some would go completely naked, others would wear white robes, and others would wear, probably most of them would wear a kind of copper-colored saffron ochre robe. And so the Bodhisattva, following their example, shaved off his hair, beard, and then put on the yellow robe, the saffron robe, and entered the homeless life. And when one entered the homeless life, the usual path that one followed was to seek out a teacher. One would be looking for somebody who knows the way to wisdom, somebody who knows the way to enlightenment. And so probably after the Bodhisattva left the palace and became a wanderer, he would meet with fellow wanderers and ask, who are the wise teachers around? Who are the top-rated gurus of the day? And so people would make some recommendations to him, and one of the people that he must have heard high praise of in different circles was a man named Alara Kalama. Okay, so now the Bodhisattva comes to Alara Kalama and he says, I want to lead the holy life in this Dhamma and discipline. And it's interesting that the text uses this double expression here. In Pali, the word is Dhamma Vinaya. And this is the word that the Buddha applies most often to his own teaching. So what the Buddha himself teaches is a Dhamma, which is the doctrine, and then the word Vinaya has come to take on the meaning of the code of monastic rules. But actually probably the older, more original sense of Vinaya is the course of training, the course of practice. And so every teacher also during this period would have had his own Dhamma Vinaya. The the Dhamma would have been some kind of philosophical doctrine which laid out kind of intellectual or conceptual structure around which the quest for enlightenment was arranged or organized. And then at the heart of his teaching, there would have been a course of training, which is not just observing rules and regulations, but it's a way of training every aspect of one's life, one's behavior, but also especially a way to train the mind through the practice of a meditative discipline. We don't know exactly what kind of doctrine and discipline Alara Kalama taught, but all we know is that he set up a certain meditative attainment as being the peak or high point of his system.